It is my great pleasure to introduce our speaker this evening. She has also asked that I refrain from long overdrawn introductions. It's something that we share as a repulsion for those kinds of long things. So Barbara Savage is an historian. She had a long and illustrious career here at the University of Pennsylvania, where she was in the history department from 1995 to 2013. At which time she moved her appointment over to the newly founded Department of Africana Studies, where she was an inaugural chair of that department. She has written books, prize-winning books. She had a visiting professorship at the University of Oxford, and they were so impressed with her that they established a prize for the best thesis in Black history. In her name, I should say. Okay. But for me, the most important thing is that she was my work wife. So she and I tag teamed in Africana Studies, chairing the department, directing the center, all the things for quite some time. And we wouldn't have the department that we have and the center that we have without her contributions. So it is my great pleasure to introduce Barbara D. Savage.
Oh, it's so nice to see everybody here. I really appreciate folks coming out. Thank you, Camille. And it is true, Camille and I tag team and work together in tandem, I think rather successfully for quite a long run, and our friendship survived that. That's the most important thing. But I really want to thank all of you for coming. There's always a lot to do at the end of the day. And thank the Penn Bookstore for hosting these events as they do all the time. My colleagues in Africana Studies, not only Camille, of course, who was my work partner for that long period, but also for the rest of my colleagues there in that department. Wale Adebonwe, who is there, who is the director of the center, thank you. He is one of many people I called on as I was doing parts of this book, of which there are many about which I knew nothing, and he graciously read a chapter on Africa and was really useful to me. So as he is he's an extraordinary Africanist himself. But as with all things in Africana Studies, nothing that we do could be done without the help of our great administrators, Tyrone Bullock, who walked me through PowerPoint. I say more about that later. Tia, where's Tia? In the back, Tia Campbell, Carol Davis, Kelly Harris, Audra Rogers, and Campbell Noblock, who's not here. Oh, hey, how are you? Anyway, this is kind of seeing these faces. This is like, this is your life, Philly. So there are people here from various places at the universities, former students, folks from my church, the African Episcopal Church of St. Thomas, friends from the neighborhood, members of my investment club. And we got to cover the waterfront here. But I also certainly want to acknowledge that this project really began a long time ago. And so I'm not going to go through everybody who's helped me, but I do want to say that a lot of people in this room helped and supported me and were patient with me over the long duration of the project. And they were very polite to me, I'm sure, when I talked obsessively about this project, whether we were walking, my walking partners are here, or more people who agreed to read chapters or drafts and who just really supported me through it. I won't name them individually. If you were to buy the book, I refer to you to page 285, 289, where there are acknowledgements where I don't think I run the risk, but Elise Mitchell here was an undergraduate in the history department and was one of my first research assistants on this book and did a rough chronology of Tate's life. And she has now finished her doctorate at NYU. And didn't you get a real job? More. So you're in the neighborhood, extraordinary scholar of slavery in the 17th and 18th century. So the circle is coming full here. So I want to say a couple of things about how I came to do this book, which is not a book I ever intended to do, but it really grew out first from a collaborative project that yielded a book in 2015 called Toward an Intellectual History of Black Women. And that was a project that came out of a friendship between me, Mia Bay, who's here now in the history department, Martha Jones and Farrah Griffin at Columbia. And it was in the course of doing that project that I needed to do something on a Black woman intellectual. And I will say more, I can say more in Q&A about what I then knew about Tate, certainly not very much, but it's that project that really pulled. And that was the first place that I published anything about Tate in the 2015 essay there. And that essay grew out of a talk I gave in the history department in 2010, and I still have notes from that talk and had extraordinary support from colleagues in the history department. And I turned back to any number of them during the course of this work. And so I just want to say that this is so much a Penn project in the sense that it grew up here. I'm grateful to the university for ample research support, because it's a project that also required a lot of travel and international travel. And then finally, it's a project that was influenced by a Leverhulme project in the UK, which I was also involved with on women in international thought, and Tate. I have some work on Tate in that too. Now, did you say, where's Camille? Right. There you are. So Marcia, say that part. She forgot to say that part. This is why we are such good work partners. Marcia Catlin is not here because of illness in her family. And so the format had been that I would speak briefly and then she and I would have a conversation, which I was looking forward to because she's an extraordinary scholar. We have a couple of questions from her, which we will sprinkle after so I had to pivot. And so I will talk a little longer than I had intended. And so I'll tell you what we're going to do. I'm going to do sort of a 15, 20 minutes max on the broad arc of her life. This is someone who lived from 1905 to 1996. You'll be pleased to know that I'm not going to try to cover all 9 decades. I do that in the book, but I'm not going to do that in the talk. And give you a sense of the contours of her life and the kind of the meanings that I attached to it in the book, the broader lessons from that. And then I'm going to read a few passages from the book to give you more, so you can hear her voice rather than me talking about her. And I'll do that for a little bit. And then as a reward, I will show you a lot of really nice photographs, okay? And then we'll open it up for questions and some discussion. And I know that there are people here who have read and I'm sure have come with all of their piercing questions too. So I think we'll be fine. And we are wishing Marcia and her family well. And she and I are going to do something together another time on something, and you will enjoy knowing her. So I'm going to just sort of jump in, which is my way, and pull you into the book and then take us through some of the broad questions here. So I'm going to sort of read a little bit of this. On a spring evening in 1921, over 400 people crammed into a high school auditorium in Battle Creek, Michigan, to witness an annual student oratorical contest where one girl and one boy would be crowned winners. Merze Tate, a 16-year-old Black girl, stood in front of that predominantly white audience and proclaimed into their silence that, quote, "For 244 years, my ancestors were held in bonds of slavery, deprived of every opportunity for mental development, civil expression, and hindered in their pursuits of human endeavor, and saw continued hatred and denial after emancipation. But in the time of global war, whites had called upon 2 million Black men from Africa, this is still heard, from the West Indies and from America, to fight that the world might enjoy the benefits of civilization. They fought as men, they fought nobly, they fought gloriously. Despite that, she argued, they were still denied liberty and the privileges of democracy." Tate did not falter as she made one bold plea after the other. And this is a 16-year-old girl saying, "Oh, America, 14 million of my people." She demanded that for 14 million of my people, that they be extended a fair chance at jobs and freedoms open to recent migrants. Taking seriously the oratorical nature of the contest, she reached back to anti-slavery rhetoric that deftly deployed the image of the heroic Black soldier, and I'll quote from her. "It was a Negro soldier that Wendell Phillips, immortal statesman and orator, said, but 50 years hence, when truth gets a hearing, the muse of history will put Brutus for the Roman, Hampden for England, Fayette for France, choose Washington as the bright consummate flower of our earlier civilization, and John Brown, the ripe fruit of our noonday. Then dipping her pen in the sunlight, will write in the clear blue above them the name of the soldier, the statesman, the martyr, Toussaint Louverture." With that, she rested her case for an end to racial inequality, while teaching her audience about the continuing consequences of slavery, the sacrifices of Black soldiers from the United States, the Caribbean, and Africa, and the continued denial of common justice to Black people here and around the globe. By invoking Toussaint, she held high the name of the Black liberator warrior of Haiti, but she also honored the Black men in her own family who had served in the Civil War and the Spanish-American War, and her older brother, who had been in the Navy in World War I. Miss Merze Tate, a colored girl, was the winner for the girls' division of the contest, her subject being the Negro in the World War, reported the Battle Creek Inquirer the next day. And for me, and I start the book with this passage, this event really marks the start of her public career, a public career that she would forge in the world that routinely disrespected Black women and men as intellectual, political, and moral inferiors. Her courage and prodigious intellectual gifts would carry her far away from her native Michigan, first to a graduate degree in the 1930s from Columbia Teachers College, but that was really just the beginning. Thanks to a fellowship from her Alpha Kappa Alpha sorority, she studied international relations at the University of Oxford, becoming in 1935 the first Black American man or woman to earn a graduate degree there. After teaching at Southern Black colleges, in particular Bennett, she went on in 1941 to be the first Black woman to earn a PhD in government from Harvard. From there, and against all odds, she assumed a 35-year professorship at the prestigious Howard University, a rare achievement for women of her generation and at any institution, whether Black or white. She aspired to be an educator who was also a producer of new knowledge and not just a consumer of it. A gifted writer and extraordinary scholar, she published 5 groundbreaking books, 2 from Harvard and 1 from Yale, and dozens and dozens and dozens of articles and review articles on the role of race in European and US imperialism in Asia, the Pacific, Africa, and elsewhere. Her groundbreaking ideas and her innovative work rivaled those of her male colleagues in the US and abroad, and in fields where few women worked then or now. As a child, Tate became fascinated by maps, geography, and travel accounts. As a teenager, news of the war of global proportions mingled with accounts from Black men in her own family, as I said at the outset, who returned from service abroad to continue racial discrimination in their home country. But their tales of travel also kindled her imagination and her determination to see the world and its wonders for herself. As an adult, she circled the globe twice, traveling alone, once east to west, once west to east. She set foot on every continent but 2, Antarctica and South America. As one of the earliest Fulbright scholars, she spent a year in India in 1950, which allowed her to explore there, in Asia and in the Indo-Pacific region. And in her 70s, she finally made it to Africa twice. During her travels, she found herself in the presence of Hitler, Pope Pius XII, Nehru, Indira Gandhi, and Desmond Tutu, to name a few. Her travel informed her work and vice versa. There are few substitutes, I think, as we all know, for seeing firsthand the places one is studying. So she mixed her missions, spending time researching in archives, touring in her leisure, and enjoying the company of new friends and colleagues along the way. The touchstones of her returns from travel were friends and families eager to hear of her adventures. She never married and had no children, and led a vibrant social life in Washington, across the US, and around the world. Her leisure was fed by her broad intellectual and cultural interests, by her prowess at the bridge table, her skills as a chef and a party giver, and by her gift for sustaining friendships across time and place. Tate moved in all those spaces with a hurried athletic grace of intentionality and purpose, dressed in the latest styles and finest fabrics popular in the social and professional worlds she inhabited, most often captured on the pages of Black newspapers. This book, then, is the story of how a young Black girl, born in 1905 on an isolated farm in the center of Michigan, pursued her twin dreams of becoming a scholar and of traveling the world with her camera in hand. Her intellectual curiosity and her travel lust were the dual reinforcing drives in her life. Her path-blazing achievements rested on her brilliance, and her hard work what required a lifetime of struggle in what she called, quote, a sex and race discriminating world, a world that many of us are really still quite familiar with. The challenges Tate faced in making a place for herself remain all too familiar, but she always credited her success to older women, Black and white, both in the US and abroad, and to sacrifices made for her by her older sister. At key junctures, a diverse group of women deployed their limited financial and institutional resources to help a younger Black woman achieve her wildly ambitious dreams. Her life story is an inspiring example of Black familial and community solidarity, and more rare, of gender commitments across racial lines in the age of Jim Crow, segregation, and international racism. Now, a personality and a will as formidable as Tate's were not without other consequences. The ego strength which sustained her drive and self-confidence sometimes blinded her to the needs of others, including members of her own family. She did not ever shy from advancing her own interests at a time when that was frowned upon for women, even more than it is today. Nor did she cloak her anger when she faced man-made obstacles, especially those imposed by the men who dominated the academic profession and the institutions where she studied and worked. Yet, she was a single Black woman who was able to live a long, healthy life of independence and professional fulfillment, and most importantly, personal freedom. Much of the credit for that goes to her crystal clear sense of self, her fearlessness, and her intellect. And as she would say, and I'll say more about this, the fact that she was born in Michigan and not in Mississippi. Her long and difficult quest to become a successful scholar is also one more chapter in the long fight by Black people to access formal education and intellectual freedom. Tate's lifetime commitment to the emancipatory potential of education was expressed not only through her writing and her teaching, but through her philanthropy, a mask of frugality over many decades, basically hid the fact that she was a very shrewd stock market investor. With the proceeds, she started to do this in the late 1930s and 1940s. She donated over $2 million in the late 1970s, that's about $10 million today, to the educational institutions that had trained her. Her generous gifts continue to do their work to this day, paying full scholarships for college students and providing research support for some preparing to become scholars. In other words, she laid up her treasures where they mattered most to her. Toward the end of her life, she was so proud of the exceptional life that she had led that she bequeathed us something few Black women have the power to generate, an historical archive. She donated papers and photographs to Howard University. Additional archival evidence of her life stretches from Oxford to India and back to Michigan, and is laid out as well on the pages of Black newspapers and academic journals. When she donated funding for scholarships and fellowships, Being a woman of some ego, she named those gifts for herself, trying to make sure that her legacy survived her death in 1996. And at the educational institutions that mattered most to her, and that would have been Western Michigan University in Kalamazoo, Radcliffe at Harvard, and Howard. The record of her prolific publication productivity and accolades came during a time when women and most Black men were routinely excluded from academic publishing. She was an interdisciplinary scholar long before that approach was in vogue. The fields in which she wrote, diplomatic history and international relations, recognized the quality and the significance of her work at the time, but never to the extent it or she deserved. Despite all of that, her life's work has all but disappeared from the narrative of American and African-American intellectual, political, and cultural life, or for that matter, Black women's history. So this is the central task that this book takes up, to rescue Tate's life and her legacy from an obscurity imposed by the virulent racial and gender politics of the academic world, both in her lifetime and in ours. For sure, who Tate was and how she was able to live a fulfilling life and do all that she did is fascinating, and that drives this narrative. One of my great fears in writing this book is that I was afraid I was going to write a really boring book about a fascinating person, and we'll leave that up to you to judge. Her life really is fascinating. So, but for me, only by excavating and critiquing her scholarship can we understand the life of her mind, which is also the aim of intellectual biography. And I take that seriously, and I treat her seriously as a scholar here, not uncritically, but I do treat her seriously. Because it is only by studying her 5 decades of writings that we can learn why she and her ideas were so ahead of her time and yet remain so relevant to the world in which 21st century readers now find themselves. And I will say again, while I'm also not going to cover 9 decades of her life or 5 decades of her writings, but I will give you a quick sense of what she was interested in and what she worked on. Her earliest writings, which come in the 1930s, take us into debates among African Americans about how best to educate Black college students for the political challenges facing them. She paid special attention to the preparation of Black women students and how to balance the demands of personal life with professional ambitions, regardless of whether the woman married or remained single or whether she became a mother or not. She also was an early advocate of science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, so-called STEM fields for Black students, hoping that the sciences might somehow be less susceptible to bias from race and gender. Her lifetime of scholarship, which does span many eras and many regions, is not rooted primarily in a critique around ideology and class, although that is certainly in there, but is tethered theoretically to what should be called an anti-racist geopolitics. She applied her critique to the history of the arms race and the US annexation of Hawaii, as well as the then contemporary developments in India and Asia, the entire Pacific region, and in Africa. Her focus was actually always on the how of imperialism, with racism operating as both a how and as a why. She concerned herself with the mechanisms and technologies of racialized imperialism to include the tools of state-sanctioned violence, and so that's arms and weapons, but she also included their concerns about missionaries and their work, and then the work of the business settler class as tools of imperialism as well. So she details the role of race and the work of settler colonists, not only in Hawaii, but in the Pacific region more broadly. And her last work was an investigation into the 1970s expansion of railroads, deep sea ports, mineral extraction, and international corporate capitalism in post-independence Africa. For her, the building and controlling of that infrastructure was as efficacious as weaponry in dominating and controlling the political and economic future of the continent. Her self-proclaimed professional identity was as a historian, and I honor that rather proudly. However, she was not really invested in disciplinary squabbles and claims, and neither am I, frankly, nor would her professional treatment have been changed by her choice of discipline in an academic world rife throughout with racial and gender restrictions. What is true is that her unusual training permitted an early embrace of interdisciplinarity, as I said, that borrowed methods from diplomatic, economic, and political history, as well as international relations. That was complemented by her careful study of geography and geopolitics, and perhaps for the same reason, a view toward a capacious conceptualization of comparative imperialism within regions and across continents, whether in the Pacific or in Africa. And so for all of these reasons, some of Tate's ideas about race and empire precede, complement, and challenge the male thinkers most associated with anti-white supremacist and anti-colonialist thought. Nor is she or her ideas easily fitted into the facile political categories which stand as shorthand but tell us little. If I've learned anything in this study of Tate's life, it's that the political categories we apply to most historical subjects in history, including in African-American studies, are too narrow and too few, and that our identification of canonical political thinkers, irrespective of their race, is too exclusionary to capture the full range and richness of African-American political thought on race and imperialism and much more. And especially without the presence of historical women thinkers like Tate. So that's one of the kind of underlying arguments in the book. And I will just say that simply adding someone like Tate, to an existing list or a syllabus strikes me also as being insufficient. Her life and her work and that of other overlooked and erased scholars requires us to do more. We must rethink our canons and our categories, which also do the work of exclusion and denial, of obscuring and limiting rather than expanding and rethinking. So these are the reasons that I think of this project as more than a mere reclamation project, more than reclaiming and elevating and bringing her life to us, because I see her life and her travels and her work as presenting an opportunity to revise and extend broader themes in 20th century African-American history, American history, women's history, history of education, diplomatic history, and international thought. And the important thing here is that for most of the 20th century, and we sometimes forget this, most Black academics were segregated scholars, to use a phrase which I did not coin, but which is apt, who spent their careers at historically Black colleges and universities, yet neither their lives or their works have received the close study they deserve, with few exceptions. So I'm trying to do that. And Tate would be one of the few women in that group, and one whose credentials and publications, as I've said, rivaled and outpaced her male peers. Invisible to a majority white world, Black educators formed a close-knit network that include those working in high schools, colleges, and universities. They all knew each other for decades and decades. She also then freely shared the knowledge that she was gathering from traveling and from her own research and writing as a public intellectual, the term we use today, by giving lectures and speeches in a Black civic sphere of Black audiences in political and social clubs, churches, sororities, and fraternities, on campuses and through the Black press. So her activism in that network spans the 1930s through the 1980s. And through that, it's a window on the struggles of that generation of Black educated people who live in Jim Crow and segregation, but also witness the move to desegregation, not without complexity and not without poignancy and regret and some hopefulness. I'll say a couple of other things about themes in the book. One is that Black domestic travel is often seen as being plagued by racism, and Black international travel is often presented as an escape from US racism. Both of those things are true, but neither captures the full range of travel practices of Black Americans who went abroad with great intentionality in that period, but for a really wider range of reasons. One of the things that was most surprising to me in doing this work is that she rarely traveled anywhere in the world without running into or staying with other Black Americans. And I was like, who are all these people and what are they doing? They're not all sitting in Paris in cafes drinking coffee with James Baldwin. Some of them are there for professional reasons, for leisure, for pleasure. Some were students and scholars like Tate, but many of them were artists, or they were athletes, or they were religious leaders, or missionaries, or journalists. They were members of the military, and increasingly over the span of her life, attached to other US government agencies. So all of this international travel, and I'm not going to write that book, but other people are, really helped Black people, and it influenced their ideas about American and African American exceptionalism and privilege, but also about the other so-called darker peoples of the world. And I just think that that's an area that I learned a lot about in doing this work, and I think it deserves more attention. The final thing I will say is, or near the final thing I will say is that there are two major tropes in Black women's history. Among the tropes in Black women's history are these two. I should put it this way, are archival absence and silence. And in this case, what I have is someone who contests all of that by leaving a record of archival abundance. I have way too much material. And also someone who's very invested in studied self-invention. This is not someone who is trying to be silent or wants to be silenced. So I think the presence of both of those things is interesting and difficult for me as a biographer, because on the one hand, the archival abundance I love, the studied self-invention I have to push back on because this is her life, but it's my book about her life. But she certainly had her own views on all of that. But it just really also, to me, and this is really important, it invites debate about the demerit of speculation on understanding the lives of 20th century Black women. There is so much stuff. This example of archival abundance is not as rare as we have been trained to think. And so in this book, Here an Archive Speaks, though filtered through my reliance, I think, on a rigorous use of methodological tools of research as an archive hound myself, or someone who thinks of herself as a narrative historian. And I bring along with that the habits of skepticism, some interpretive authority, but also a deep disdain for fabrications, however well-intentioned. I'd be happy to say more about that. And I will now be moving towards closing this bit out. So as is, I think, often the case with our most difficult and fulfilling endeavors in life, I had no idea how much work this project would be or how long it would take, even before the complications and delays caused by the 2020 pandemic. And it is very much a pandemic book, for better or for worse, in the sense that I certainly had blocks of time. But on the other hand, there's always the risk of deep immersion and not being able to emerge yourself from that and with your mind intact. I would put it that way. And the other thing is that her archival trail and her own travels then took me as a researcher by trains and planes and cars from Philadelphia to Michigan, New York, Cambridge, and overseas to Thailand, India, Hawaii, and a year at Oxford. But as with all of my scholarly work, many days over many years were spent working in one of my favorite places, Howard University's Founders Library, right in the center of their quad, and its rich collections in the Moreland Spingarn Research Center. I would climb the steps of that red brick building with its white columns, buildings from the 1930s. I'd open the wooden doors and I'd turn right. And time after time, I would stop and look at this display case in the hall. As this is Howard and this archive, my entire career has depended on this archive, every single book. And this display had been there for a very long time, and I always stop. It traces the history of the campus in photographs. And that's where I first learned the architectural phrase desire lines, which is a concept of describing footpaths, the pathways you make by foot off the concrete pathways that are so neatly laid out. So that in some ways, this book really follows the desire lines of Merze Tate's life as she went her own way and made a place for herself in a world where the designated roots for a Black girl born in 1905 could not contain her ambitions, her brilliance, and her courage. And to understand how she built a life of personal and intellectual freedom for herself, you'll need to read or listen to the book. He is reminding me to bring some of my lunch for one call. Thank you. I'm just going to read a couple of little bits so you can hear her voice a little bit more than mine, and then we'll move into the slides and we'll then do the rest of the time for Q&A. And I'm happy to dig into this. All right, and speaking of travel, one of the things that she does in the 1930s, she's teaching in a high school in Indianapolis. She's made her first trip abroad, and she takes a group of, she's a high school history teacher. She takes a group of Black students, about 40 of them, from Indianapolis on a train to Washington, D.C., and shows them everything possible. They stay at Howard. They stay at the Whitehall Hotel, because this is certainly, she's got to navigate all the rules of segregation and Jim Crow, and she gets them there and back. They have a great time. She then writes and publishes an article. And this is actually the earliest published thing by her that I've found. And it's called Should Colored Children Travel? And this is when she gets back. And so she's and she's describing the response of people to this two train cars of young Black students, and I'll show you a picture of them. White and colored alike marveled at the splendid conduct of the group. The dining car waiters, who would have all been Black, appeared to be bubbling over with joy. They stated it was the greatest pleasure they had had to serve two dining cars of well-behaved, educated colored youth. Compared with white groups of students, one waiter declared that our children were perfect. The railroad's representative spoke of the attractiveness and the neatness of our coach when it arrived in Washington after 43 had occupied it for 19 hours. The fact that she is writing this, but also having to make the case for Black students being able to do this, it captures the moment, but it also shows the centrality of travel as an educational tool and her investment as well in that travel club. The other two excerpts are from when she's at Oxford she's there from 1932 to 1935. She takes an exam for her degree, and she does not, and she fails it. And this is the dark secret of her life. It took me a long time to figure out that happened because she covered it. It's the one thing that I know she covered up. And so, and this will tell you why, I think, to some extent. So she's writing to the people at Oxford. I should say, it is not unusual to fail that exam the first time through. It was the first time she ever failed anything in her life. So she was a straight A student, the best student at all of these predominantly white institutions that she'd gone through. So this was a real stab in the heart. And so she's writing to the head of that college she's in. She says, if ever another young colored woman should apply to come up to Oxford, I hope that you will judge her on her own merits and not think of me and all the trouble I caused. There are hundreds of colored women in America who would come up to Oxford and be successful, though they would have money enough to live free from financial worries, and she did not have money enough, and brains sufficient to pass any examination. It is most unfortunate that I, as a pioneer, had to face so many difficulties and then not succeed. It is the first great failure of my life, but I am anxious that others should not suffer because of my failure. She went on and took the exam the next year and got the degree and became the first Black American to get a graduate degree from Oxford. And one of the things that she's proud about is that Elaine Locke had been the first Black Rhodes Scholar, as many of you will know, and he came back and claimed to have had a degree, but he never got the degree, and she knew that. And she was one of the few people who understood the system well enough that that would be legible to her. So she was very, very invested in being the first Black person to get the degree, and she got it. And when she comes back, she goes and talks to her Alpha Kappa Alpha sorority, and I'll just speed through this. And these are the folks who helped her get there with $1,000 scholarship. She said, throughout the 3 years I spent in England, I was ever conscious of being a pioneer representing AKA in particular and Negro womanhood in general. The latter fact was impressed upon me by the circumstance that I was the first colored woman to matriculate at Oxford, and as far as I know, the first colored American to receive the higher degrees you signify my lock. In both curricula and extracurricular activities, in both the lecture and the drawing room, I was continually mindful of my representing a race which is ever striving against almost insurmountable difficulties to reach seemingly unattainable heights in history. So we see both the kind of the burden and the privilege of racial representation there. She has very strong views on how to educate Black students in the 1930s and 40s when that debate is raging among Black educators. Her views were that how best to teach history to Black students. She argued for, quote, less time on Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar and more on Hitler and Mussolini. In order to understand Central Europe and Hitler's Mein Kampf, we must know well the era of Versailles and French hegemony. She argued that appreciating the factors involving the Italian attack on and conquest of Ethiopia, this has been in the 1930s, in the Peace of Munich and Japanese aggression in the Far East and the present Sino-Japanese conflict, it's impossible without a background knowledge of European history and imperialism since 1870, and especially the history of the past 24 years. So she's arguing for a very broad education, which can then be deployed in ways that are of benefit to African Americans being trained to kind of continue that work. And I'll just conclude with this, which is to say that one of the big struggles of her life, as you can imagine, being a woman at Howard in the 1940s, and this is not an attack on Howard, I give Howard credit because it was one of the few institutions that was actually hiring women in the 1940s. And so she engaged in a very aggressive fight there always for gender equality or against gender inequity there, and talked at great length about how she was overburdened as a teacher. And also, Tyrone, your time's coming up now, as a teacher and also as a woman who was required to chair the department twice, including once before she was actually even in a permanent position, required to teach 25 different courses. The men get all the perks and the women do not. This also seems familiar. And that was the real constant struggle of her life at Howard the whole time she was there. So that's a quick, it's not dirty, it's a quick look. And now we will, with the help of my able hiring crew, we had a lovely time working on this earlier in the day. I'm going to show you some quick photographs. Are we okay time-wise, Camille?
I think so.
Okay.
Yeah.
I know. I just, just being polite. Thank you. That may have seemed simple. All right, so the great thing about her life is that for me, she's one of the, there's so much photographic evidence of her from her childhood to her death. And so I just want to run through that, and this will reward you for your patience. This is Tate with her, that's Tate, her brother Keith, and her mother. And this is in, as I said, central Michigan. Her family came from, her grandparents were homesteaders there under the Homestead Act of 1862. Again, Tate, her brother Keith, her brother Theodore and Herschel, and her older sister Cynthia, who helped fund her education. Here's Tate, fourth grade. Here's Tate here. This is her brother Keith down here. And there may be two other Black students in this class. The photograph, it hints at that, but I don't know that for sure. And this is the change. This is high school, when all of a sudden she's the only Black student. This is 10th grade in Michigan. That would be in Battle Creek. That's Tate growing up in this period, getting through high school. These are beautiful. And I can say more about that. This is college graduation photograph. 1927 from Western Michigan State Teachers College. And here is Tate in the 1920s. One of the things that someone can do, but not me, there's a whole little article being written about her fashion. And so I include the photographs to demonstrate. This is Tate in Indianapolis in the 1920s, posed. This is a beautiful velvet dress, beautiful shoes. That much I can't see. That's the extent of my fashion knowledge. Here she is in 1931 on her first trip abroad. There she is under blankets, reading a very large book. Here she is at Oxford. That's the cover of the book. This is actually the photograph the first time I saw this, and that's her typewriter, a student at Oxford. So if you have ever been to Oxford, if you've not, this is kind of the quintessential Oxford place. This is the Radcliffe camera. You pass it everywhere. I passed it every single day I was there. And this is a fairly typical place to be photographed in your robe and whatever. This is All Souls Church behind it. Can you see that? Can I make it big? Yeah, you can see it. Okay. And there's a lot to be said about that bicycle. She didn't know how to ride a bike until she got there, and she learned. This is her Oxford regalia, which she wore always, even after she got the Harvard degree. She never did the crimson robe. She preferred the Oxford ones. So like that, you can see why. Here she is as a young woman in the 1930s at Penn in college. Again, fashionable. And this is her in 1942 reading from her first book, which is the book on disarmament. But interesting self-presentation as a scholar here. And this one puzzled me for a long time. The club Copacabana, but it's not. It's her here in Germany during the occupation with Black soldiers. This was a German officers club, which was then Black soldiers took over, and then they called it the Club Copacabana. and I think it was that. But she knows a lot of these soldiers because she taught them at Howard. But that went through me. Here she is in Egypt. This is the Todd family, a Black family, then stationed at the embassy. And this is her in India here, I believe India. Yeah. But you see her moving in spaces with women in ways that male travelers would not have. And I like the tusk here especially. And this is her coming back from Fulbright. And this is when people dress to travel. Yeah. This is her traveling. Yeah. Look at this little young man here who's going, they're all going to meet. This is at DC National Airport on that trip. Flowers, welcome back to the travel bag. Okay. This is her giving talks about her time in England in a church. This is her dressed in a sari because she thought it was really important for when she would give talks to Black women's groups. She would demonstrate how to wrap and wear. This is her being fashionista. I like the feathers and the fabric on the suit. This is her with some friends, and this is her movie camera. I couldn't use this in the book because the quality is not good enough, but it's one of the few I have with her just like hanging out. And what do we have here? This is her towards the end of her life with these men who she kept in touch with from World War II. This is in 1978. And this is her being honored at Radcliffe. She's here. This is Adrienne Rich, the poet, next to her. And I do have the names of the other women. I don't have them in front of me. And this is a photograph from the Black Women's Oral History Project. So this is the very end of her life. And it's one of the few where she's smiling because she's self-conscious of the fact that she has a gap. Which took me a long time to figure out why she never smiled. So that's it. All right.
Okay, so we're gonna open it up for questions, and I'm gonna let Barbara manage that herself. But I'm gonna do two things here. The first is that I'm gonna let you all know that we have books here afterwards for Barbara to sign, and you would pay for them downstairs on your way out. The second is that I'm gonna take, yeah, or if you brought your own, she can still sign it. And then I'm gonna take, I don't know, hostess privilege, and, I'm gonna pose the first question, and
From Marcia.
and these are actually questions that Marcia had intended to pose, and they're actually not written as questions. So I'm gonna read this and let you get the question out of it. So, because it actually is relevant to Marcia and her work. So she said, I have some experience writing about Black women from the Midwest.
She does.
And the really specific ways they navigated a different kind of color line prior to their contact with the Jim Crow segregation of their era. I think that they often frame it as a strange asset, but it can also be its own liability. Also, her family's access to land as homesteaders is really fascinating to Marcia, and she would like you to comment on that.
As I said, one of the things that Tate would say often is that it made all the difference in the world that she was born in Michigan and not in Mississippi. And, you know, obviously, if you're in Michigan and not subject to the kind of harsh day-to-day reality of living under that kind of racial brutality, I hasten to say Michigan was no racial utopia. I mean, the first time I went to visit the town she grew up in. This was in like 2016. I took the turn off the big highway to get to the little road, and the first thing I saw was a Confederate flag, which I recognized from my childhood in the South. But what it did mean is that her family had access to land. They were not sharecroppers. That's one thing. They were not well off, even though they were well dressed here, and I can say something about that. And that they were probably cash poor. But in any event, it is still not the same as being a sharecropper in Michigan. But the most significant thing for her was that she had access to a really great elementary and secondary and college education, state funded, that she would not have had in Mississippi or Alabama or Virginia, where I grew up. And so that's what Michigan means for her. But the fact that she was in the Midwest and not in the South or in Chicago or in New York is one of the complexities that I talk about here, because the challenge in talking about her is that she doesn't fit in any of the categories that would have made this a lot easier for me to do. And so her life is just like all out there. And so then I have to really think about what it means to be Midwestern, not Northern or Southern.
Yes.
And the Midwest, Ohio's in your background?
Illinois, yeah.
Illinois, but it is a different place and it's understudied. And so that's my general, Marcia's written a great book about women in Chicago, which I taught. So that's as much as I'll say about that right now. But it is not the case. But I reckon, and I do have to kind of, people want to say, oh, this all happened because she was in Michigan. I think it all happened because she wasn't in Mississippi, which is not the same thing. So anyways, that was the first one. Did you want to pose a second one? Or I can take questions. I know some people here who have read maybe, Mia Bay. Do you mind? And you can come back to it. Hey, Mia, thank you.
I just always wondered how she got to the annexation of Hawaii and like why that.
How that happened?
Yeah, like why this was something she chose to write.
In 1948, she had imagined what's now called, there's a word for it now, a trans-imperial project on the entire Pacific region. And when I say trans-imperial, what I mean is that it would be US imperialism, British imperialism, pick any country, Germany, all of them. And she was going to write this mega history of that region. And when she came back from the Fulbright in 1951, she stopped in Hawaii. She stayed with Black soldiers, families there. And she just had an epiphany. I could just do this on the US and I could just do it on Hawaii, because she began to think then of Hawaii and the annexation, the eventual statehood, as one of the earliest examples of American imperialism abroad. So she moves the timeline back before the Spanish. For most people, that period is thought to begin at the Spanish-American War at the turn of the century in the 1890s. She says, no, it begins in the 1820s when the missionaries come from Boston to go to Hawaii. And that's how it begins. She just decides we'll just do the US. And then she later expanded and did more work on the Pacific, Australia, New Zealand, and all of that, and the British there. But that's how she got to Hawaii. So, Rogers, and thank you for being here. You actually have read the book too.
I haven't, it was fascinating. So,
Thank you. Thank you.
and I have a lot of questions, but one that I was most uncertain about at the end was how to understand her overall political outlook, because she's a pioneer in arguing that we should examine this racialized geopolitics, racialized imperialism, but you stress that she wasn't, she's kind of dismissive of grand theories and grand ideologies and wanted to focus on the actual mechanisms of how imperialism works. So I get that capturing her broader outlook is hard, but I was interested that she became the successful capitalist investor. You also stress that she converted to Catholicism quietly late in life.
Yeah.
And so, and so, I thought, well, is she fundamentally someone who is seeking integration into existing economic and political institutions and worldviews? Does she have a more radical outlook? And if so, how would you call it?
Yeah, she's slippery in that way. I think she had a very radical outlook, but she didn't. And she knew the theoretical underpinnings of imperialism. I mean, that's in the book. She includes it, and she's like, I'm not really interested. And she names all the theorists, and she's read them, and she's really like, I just want to see that practically, how does this work? But it's difficult for me to. So, for example, and because I'm so beholden to sources, I really wanted her to tell me what she thought about. So, what I wanted her to do was to tell me, what did you think about the civil rights movement? What did you think about Black Power? What did you think about the Vietnam War? And I have an uneven record of that. I can guess at it, but I still think she's much more radical, but not in the sense that I would call her a radical Black woman scholar, which would have sold more books, frankly. And so I would say that not being able to nail her down is just sort of, for me, it was daunting and a challenge, but it also is a reflection of, I think she's a really independent thinker and really resistant to all sorts of labels. And other people might disagree. And I give everybody in the back of the book is an appendix of everything she ever wrote. Go at it, tell me I'm wrong, do with it what you will. And I read her work through the lens of what I am, which is an African-American historian. And that was one of the big challenges of this and why I'm so dependent and thankful for so many people in this room. It would have been a much easier biographical project had she simply studied African-American history, something I do know a little bit about. But instead, I had to read and understand her work as best I could on the Pacific, on armaments, on take me on railroads. And so I was stressed and pulled in all sorts of, and in regions I know nothing about. I mean, so I had to get help from folks who study the regions that she studied. And so what is that to say? That's to say, it was hard, I don't know anymore. It's part of the complexity, and it's part of and I can say something about what it's like to do a biography, because Wale wanted me to say something that I forgot. It is a biography. It's a biography done by a historian, and I never intended to do one. It's an extraordinarily difficult genre. I will say that Mia's done one. And it's also the first project that feels, the book is finished, but I now understand why people write 400, 600, and 900-page biographies, because I can go, and there's 103,000 words here, and I did have like a real word limit, thankfully, but it could have grown, because every thread you can follow. And I think it also makes it difficult to contextualize her work and her life, mostly because she would never sit still. And so the travel was extraordinarily vexing for me, because I can't contextualize all of India. I had to do some of it, and then she goes here, and she goes Soviet, and she's everywhere. And if you're trying to bring a biography reader along, you need to give them enough context to understand. So in any event, that was one of many challenges here. So I kind of wandered on that question. In the back, hi, Laura. Lauren, no, it's not, Laura, it is Laura. Hi.
Following up on the difficulties of biography.
Laura Helton is finishing, you're at Delaware, you're finishing a great book on, thank you for coming, on art, on Black archives and the folks who invented them, created them and did the collecting, which has a title now.
Thank you for that, but this is your book.
Okay, that's right.
Given the global scope of this story and the expansive archive, I would imagine there are many storylines that fascinated you, but you couldn't figure out how to get in a book that wasn't 900 pages. I'm curious about those storylines that you still kind of puzzle over a lot of.
I think I hit the main ones that I wanted to hit. I think the question of her thought, there were two things she doesn't give that I don't know about, despite all my best efforts. The Catholicism she hid from me for a long time. But when you die and you have a Catholic mass, so I had to call the church and get a lovely nun to send me her baptismal thing and the mass, and so she converted in 1960. I know the time why she converted then. I think it was a response to her sister's death that year, but she had been interested in Catholicism in hindsight for many, many years, and that's sprinkled throughout. But she didn't talk about it when she was interred at the cemetery in Michigan. People from the local community came who had grown up with her, and it was the first time that many of them knew she was Catholic. But I don't know what else to do with that. Many of her friends were Black Catholics in Washington, D.C. And so people, because I'm looking for religion, that's what I do. I had to find that. She also does not talk about intimate sexual relationships with anyone. There is some vague mention of a boyfriend who she abandoned to go to Oxford and never looked back. He's the one who taught her bridge. And she mentioned him many years later, and she said, he's had 3 wives since then. And I thought that was enough. All I needed to know. And so, but that is also, certainly something I was looking for, and I don't know what to do with that. And so I emphasize what I do know is that, she was single and happy and independent and was not lonely. And had all of these rich friendships around the world and in Washington, and tried to make a way for a woman in that period to decide to do that. And I take it as a decision, and a decision not to have children. It would have been difficult for her to have the life she did if she'd had either a husband, a partner, or children, or been as dutiful a daughter as she could have been. Yes.
With all the pictures that you showed, did she tell you anything about her relationship with her father?
Yes. This is complicated. Her mother was married twice. I should say that, yeah, because the picture of her and the younger brother, they are from second marriage. The first marriage ended in divorce because that father was sued for non-support. Okay, that was not her father, that was that. And then her mother remarried, and then almost immediately separated from Tate's father when she was about 6 or 7. They split up the land. He lived across the street, she lived here, because that was the only fungible asset. And I know nothing else about him. She says nothing about him. He eventually dies. He has mental issues as he's older and dies in a mental institution. And that she does not speak of him tells me what? I don't know. I say more about it in the book, but she talks about her mother. She never mentions her father. So there's some trauma there that I can't guess at exactly, except she basically just buries herself in becoming the student that she becomes. It happens at exactly the same time as she's beginning school, which is not unusual, 6 or 7. Okay? Did you just say, Yeah, she's a psychologist. Thanks to me, Elise. And then we'll.
So I was wondering, we as historians are not necessarily charged with protecting people from their past, but at the same time, there's a way in which you were very gentle with which areas you probed and which areas you couldn't push past because of your resistance in part to fabrication, I think.
Well, I was not gentle in looking for it. I
Not-
searched and searched and searched, and because you went through the.
Yes, I went through the journals, I remember.
Yes,
But,
and at least it created one of the early kind of, let's speak chronicles of her life. Where is she? What is she doing?
yeah.
Yeah, I still have that document.
Thank you for that opportunity. It was an incredible opportunity. I'm wondering if you could talk about that in relationship to your resistance to fabrication. If you'd be willing to talk about that sort of methodological issue, especially for 20th century historians who, as you say, have such abundant archives, and for a woman who has such an abundant archive as well.
I didn't find it necessary. And I wouldn't have done it anyway. I'm not comfortable with it by temperament, but also as a professional historian, training certain methodologies, which I take very rigorously. And especially when I have an archive that's still like occupying a whole room in my house at home. Because I haven't had the energy to actually close it down. And so I saw no need to do that. And it wasn't necessary. I wouldn't have done it. And I say in the book, there's only so much, there are things that are unknowable, even about the people we know in this room. And I don't feel any need. So I honor it. I just say, I can't figure this out. She doesn't tell me. Here's 1,000 other things I know about her. Do with this what you will. And if other people want to extrapolate, they can, but I was not interested in doing. I think speculation and no, I think that there are dangers in it, even from the most educated and the most well-intentioned. And as a historian, and as someone actually in my deep, dark past was trained as a lawyer, so I actually am much more evidentiarily inclined than most historians, and probably not necessarily for the good. But I really do kind of hew to what I can say was something behind it. But I can certainly I can guess as well as anyone ever about her, but I don't do it in the book.
Dr. Savage, thank you for your presentation.
It's so nice to see you.
So you mentioned Howard and the library there.
Yeah.
And you mentioned Bennett and of course,
Thank you, Kathy.
and how, can you frame kind of what she believed about HBCUs and
Yes. She will spend most of all of her academic career in Black college campuses, and we should probably, I don't know how we're doing, who's in charge of time?
yeah,
Thank you.
He's saying that.
why don't you just throw us out?
Yeah, lock us in, baby. Okay, thank you. She spent her entire academic career first at Bennett and then at Howard, which came in 42 and was there until 77. So from 42 to 77 at Howard, she's going through Brown, Black Power, student uprisings, and there in 68, all of it. And so what you see with her in that generation of Black educated people or educators, they do talk a lot about desegregation and what's going to be lost. She knew a lot of high school teachers in Washington, D.C., and she's like, okay, you're going to integrate this system, but who's really going to run it? Because my friends are already losing jobs as teachers and principals in North Carolina and other places where they're trying to integrate. So there's that kind of reluctance, I think. And also, I think there is this fear that for that generation had to work so hard and struggle so hard. They want the next generation to not be too soft or too underprepared to take advantage of the opportunities that are beginning to open up in the 60s and 70s. So it's a really odd tension. There's some pride among them that they did what they did under these circumstances, but they also want the next generation to continue that same kind of, we're doing this, as an act of racial solidarity.
It's almost as if she transcended all of those categories.
Should I call on you? She transcends the categories of, she challenges them.
Yeah.
She complicates them all. She doesn't fit. She doesn't fit. She would say, and she used the word in the 70s sense of it, she'd say, this is why my students think I'm a freak. That she used the word freak, or my colleagues think I'm a freak because I'm doing this work and then I work on the Pacific, then I decided I want to work on Africa. What kind of a freak are you? And she wore it as a badge of honor, you know, so, yeah.
When you shifted to Mussolini and Hitler, I was getting ready to tell I thought, she said Mussolini and Hitler.
I did.
Yeah.
Okay, well, they ended up the last one just because.
Yeah, I was going to shut up because of the response to the last but one question, but I'll ask anyhow. I was wondering if you deliberately left the question of loneliness and failure in Oxford. And I mean, you touched on it, did you decide to abandon it or?
No, I got a whole chapter on it.
Oh, okay, was it redefining for her? Because, I mean, these places can be very, I went to Cambridge in 2008.
Yeah,
Extremely lonely for, you know, a Black person. So I can imagine that time. And I was wondering how that defined and how redefined her life. And then the question of failure, especially since she was encountering the first time, maybe also as a function of difference in the system.
Oh, yeah.
Teaching, you know.
Yeah. No, the Oxford system would have been, was and is and would still be very difficult for American students because it's a completely different system. They don't really teach you there. They tend to you go up and you read and you're examined, they don't really teach. But also was not trained to do the kind of work that she wanted to do. She went there and studied economics and international relations. And she didn't have that background, but they admitted her and they said, she's the kind of person, if she gets here, she's gonna make the best, you know, they wanted to give her a chance. This is what I think, is that she was a solo traveler. Well, a solo traveler knows how to deal with loneliness, or you don't become a solo traveler. I see her as a young child. She's walking to school in snow up to her hips. She's reciting Chaucer and, you know, all of these poems and all of that. She's a person who has a life of the mind as a child. And so she knows how to keep herself occupied. Does that mean she wasn't lonely? I'm sure. But she will always say, and I wasn't lonely for a single day, which to me is a sign that you might have been. Preempt that question. But I don't, in fact, I actually talk about it. And especially as she gets older, she's much more vulnerable in the documents I have. And it's really a fascinating thing that we can see her aging. And this was a challenge for me, and this is the last thing I will say, to be a Black woman scholar, writing about a Black woman scholar at the end of my career, and then following her entire life and her career and her death. This was very challenging to me emotionally. I'm still not over that. And if we talk about this more, I will probably cry, which I'm pledged not to do. So it's extraordinary in biographical work, which in someone, Erica Armstrong Dunbar said this to me, and I poo-pooed it at the time, but she said biography is different, and it is. My engagement with her in this book is different emotionally. I'm in it much more than I really want it to be, but it's just a whole different engagement when you sit there and you go through the papers and whatever of someone from start to finish. So I haven't really processed that yet. And I had to detach and deny. There were psychologists in the room and compartmentalize to be able to just get it done. And I'm just now paying actually the emotional consequences of that. I'm completely exhausted. And it's really difficult. It's the hardest book I've done. And I admire people who do biography, which is actually not even a genre that I read. All right, isn't that enough? Yeah, I'll be happy to talk about that.
Well, I just want to thank everybody for coming and thank Barbara for sharing with us this evening. And just remind you that she's here to sign books and sell books and
Big part of the gig.